So George, thanks for coming in to talk with us today about how you became an educational researcher, came to UCI, the research you're doing, the work you're doing in Orange County. Let's start off with the first order question. What drew you to educational research and sociology in particular?
It's really an eclectic series of experiences I've had. It all started as a teenager in the 60s. On TV, I was watching the civil rights movement and dogs and with police in Alabama, and the unfairness of that struck me very strongly. And my parents were from the previous generation, and so we would end up arguing over what we were seeing and what should be done. On the other side, I always felt that life was precious and that you should spend your time on something really important. And to me, the most important thing was knowing how the universe worked, how everything physically works. And so Albert Einstein was my hero. And I thought that pursuing science was, in a way, the only way to escape death, that you would be doing something so valuable and so important, and you would learn such secrets that it would be okay when you got to the end. And so when I went to college, I majored in math. But during that time period, there were anti-Vietnam war demonstrations, and I marched around Columbia, and I was in the March on Washington, and later I marched down Fifth Avenue with the Women's March. And so the Times suggested I should do something with my interest in civil rights and fairness. And I ended up in a program in mathematical sociology at Cornell. I hadn't known there was such a thing, but there was. It looked more promising at the time than it has turned out to be. But I studied that, and I was hired at Yale as an assistant professor in sociology, but with a joint appointment in the School of Public Policy, basically, which threw me in with a lot of economists. And so I started learning about economics. Then I worked for a consulting company called Apt Associates, and they were evaluating Jimmy Carter's youth employment program called the Youth Incentive Entitlement Pilot Projects. And this was a part-time job during the school year and a full-time job during the summer if the student agrees to stay in school. So it was aimed at high school students from low-income families. Congress put up something like $300 million to do this as an experiment, as an intervention. And of course, I'd never heard of such things, but this was the time period when social experiments were starting and public policy as a field was starting. So we were actually, this consulting company was working for a group called Manpower Demonstration Research Corporation. And I was going to analyze the data, which is what we did. But I also traveled around the country with them when they went to observe the implementation of these programs that they were evaluating. And I was very impressed with the fact that these were Central City youth, that the employers were willing to hire them, but they had to be subsidized to do so. And I began to sort of see the poverty that I had cared about as a teenager. I started seeing it in real life, and I started seeing interventions to work on it in real life. And then you learn more about how the world works. After that, I went to University of Texas at Dallas, which was really, the School of Social Sciences was really a policy school. And so once again, I was among economists, and we were basically all doing our own research, but I met Paula England, who was studying comparable worth and inequality for women's wages, and that seemed like right alongside my interests. And so we started writing papers together. But at some point, I think it was around 1985, I decided that I really wanted to go back to studying youth, and the program that I had been evaluating was a mixture of school and work. And the more I thought about it, the more I thought that the problems of low-income children start very early. And when we talked to the employers, they were, in many cases, reluctant to take these kids as workers, and they had to be incentivized to do so. And the reason for that was that they didn't think they would be very good workers. And so as I thought about that, I thought, well, you need to start earlier. And if you're going to start earlier, then it takes you to school. And so I went to the Dallas School District, and I found the people who kept the data and asked them if they wanted to work with me. And we'd analyze the data and see what was going on in the district. So that's how I came to education.
Your career, I know, at one point brought you to Penn State, and then you came to UCI before it was a school of education, a department of education. What motivated the move out here?
Well, at UT Dallas, I had gotten involved with the business community, in particular the president of Texas Instruments, who was unhappy with the school district and ran for the school board and was elected. And he said, well, you seem to know something about the schools, and we in the business world don't really. So would you work with us and tell us how we can improve things? And I did that, and I became disappointed in their efforts because they really didn't know what to do. And so they would meet with teachers, and the teachers would say they wanted to do better, and then the next day it was the same old thing. So at that point, I decided that I needed to do something myself if I was going to see anything interesting. And so I looked at the data. The business guys were asking me, what can we do? And what I saw was that the average 8th grader in the Dallas schools was reading at the 5th grade level, which means most of the students in 8th grade couldn't easily read the assigned textbooks. And so I decided we should do something about reading, and reading starts early. And so I decided to become a reading expert. And I looked at the literature. I found some of the best programs in the country. I went and I spoke to them. And I learned that the most effective instruction, certainly remedial instruction, is one-to-one tutoring. And I thought to myself, I could do that with college students. And since the schools used to do it, still do it, with teachers, and teachers are very expensive, after school, extra pay, extra work, extra tutoring. The trouble with that is they can't afford to have enough teachers doing that to tutor all the kids who need it in a low-income district. So I started this tutoring program, and I based it on these other programs that I had seen. And I did it with students, and it grew larger and larger. And eventually it helped create President Clinton's reading initiative called America Reads, which incentivizes universities to use college work-study students as tutors, and which exists in about 800 universities today. So I did that through the 90s, and I was now very interested in education. I was in a school of public policy, and There were people there who were studying criminology, crime. There were people studying air pollution. Every public issue, there was someone there on the faculty who was doing research about it and ultimately hoping to make things better. So I fit right in with my education evaluation, but I felt that kind of the science side has always been there. And so I've always believed in doing things as a science, getting into the details, being properly skeptical of what we really know until I've done my best to learn as much as I can. And so this got me interested in the details of schooling, something I had not known very much about. The tutoring program expanded at one point to 32 schools in Dallas, and I had a whole staff running it. But of course, I was going from school to school, and I was talking to principals and getting them to sign up for the program and working with people just under the superintendent. So I learned a lot about education and school districts and what the schools look like in these neighborhoods. And so I would say that by that time, I was really deep into education, and it was probably around 1990 that I said to myself, well, I guess I'm a sociologist of education, and started going to the meetings of those people. So by the end of the 1990s, I had been doing this program for 10 years, and I had been publishing more papers that were just about schools. And the Penn State Sociology Department offered me a job. And UT Dallas, while a very good university, is still struggling to emerge into the larger groups of well-known universities in the country, whereas Penn State was long established, and their sociology department was ranked number 14 in the country. And it looked like another opportunity, and so I took it. I went there in 2000, and I kept doing educational studies. I actually implemented the tutoring program for about 5 years in a low-income rural district near there. But in 2008, it's very cold in Pennsylvania in the winter, and Penn State is in a very rural area, so lets you get a lot of work done, but it's not an ideal place to live. And every winter, I would start looking at job ads just to cheer myself up. And suddenly I read this ad, and it sounded exactly like me. Quantitative social scientist who studies inequality in schools. So I thought, what the hell? And I sent a CV in. And the next thing I knew, I got a phone call. And I came down for an interview. And it was a Department of Education, which I didn't know that much about. Now, at Penn State, as I did more and more studies of education and had graduate students in sociology who wanted to study education, I told one of them to go find someone in the School of Education that could serve on his committee to help our knowledge. And I hit it off well with that guy, and we started writing papers together, and that got me even deeper into education. I also met a young assistant professor who's done very well since then and become very prominent in the country, named Sean Reardon. And he told me about this new data set that the U.S. Department of Education had collected the early childhood longitudinal study, and they had 20,000 students who'd entered kindergarten, and they were following them through 8th grade, and they were interviewing the parents and getting the school records and interviewing the teachers. It seemed like an ideal data set. And I started, with my colleague, writing papers from that data set. And approaching it as a sociologist who wanted to get into the details of things, I realized that there was a whole set of studies that could be done with these data that some people were doing a little bit, but it seemed to me there was a lot of opportunity there. And so I started analyzing those data. So writing papers more directly about the determinants of inequality. And since I'd been reading other people's studies and learned that inequality is already there, whatever grade you look at, eighth grade, sixth grade, you should take it back as far as you can. So these data, you could look at kids entering kindergarten. And so I discovered that the inequality was there. And indeed, it wasn't much different than the inequality that you see at the end of high school. So that got me very interested in early childhood interventions. And I'd already been doing a tutoring program for elementary school students. So I expanded my studies of, there was another data set just like this one, except it took children from birth. So that meant I could write papers and do investigations of children between birth and kindergarten entry. And so we did some of that. So I was starting to have a very full set of studies of the details of educational achievement. And my graduate student was interested in special ed and who gets placed into that. And so we wrote some papers about that. So we were writing about multiple topics in education because these data allow you to do that. And I had meanwhile, used my math background to teach the graduate statistics in all the departments I'd been. And that allowed me to apply advanced statistical methods to the data. So if you have very good methods and very good data, then you're likely to do work that people are interested in. So it turned out I really was a good fit for this Department of Education. And it turned out that they had a new dean who'd come from Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin, and she had great ambitions for this department. And she hired me and a number of other people. And one of them was a guy named Greg Duncan who came from Northwestern. And when I had been studying children, I had been reading his work and feeling that he was probably the best in the world at studying children in poverty. So the dean who had hired me, she had made her academic reputation by studying a major data set and study of early childhood, childhood care. The NICHD study of early child care was a monument to learning about child care, and she'd been one of the principals in that. So I accepted the offer, and here I was in a Department of Education, which eventually, as we built the faculty, became a school of education. And here were these great people to collaborate with. So I kept collaborating with the people in Penn State, and I started collaborating with these new people. And I found I was producing more research than at any previous time in my life. So I ended up a perfect fit for a school of education. But if you told me that in 1972, I would have been amazed.
It seems some of this ties back to your core interest in reading and interventions at an early age.
In my research and other people's research on how is it that when they get to school, children from lower income, less well-educated parents do less well, once again, I like to really get into the technical details of the science. So that makes you want to know, how do kids learn to read? And how do they learn to do math? And you learn that in kindergarten, there are already things the kid needs to know. They really need to know all their letters. There are 26 lowercase letters and 26 uppercase letters. That's 52 letters. A kid in kindergarten needs to learn or know if they went to preschool and have already been taught it, or maybe their parents taught it to them using plastic letters. They need to know these 52 letters, and they need to know not only the name of the letter, but the sound it makes. That's a fair amount of information. They need to know the numbers. They need to perhaps have had some rudimentary counting. So it turns out that from the perspective of a 5-year-old entering kindergarten, there's a fair amount of things to know. And it turns out that the kids from the better educated parents know those things a lot more than the kids from the less well educated parents. In fact, if you give assessments of that, and the developmental psychologists have learned how to do this, they can in fact give very reasonable, accurate assessments of what kids know, starting as young as 2 years old. One of the key things is vocabulary. If you're going to learn to read, which is supposed to happen in first grade, after you already know all your letters and sounds, if you're going to learn to read, you're going to need to sound out a word, basically. And after you've sounded it out, you're supposed to know what it means, because you have an oral English vocabulary that contains a lot of words. But it turns out that the better educated parents speak millions more words to their children between birth and kindergarten than do the less well educated parents. And it's both the number of word interactions, it's how much they talk to one another, but it's also the number of different words. So the kids from a better educated family tend to come to kindergarten with a much more extensive vocabulary. And so they already have this advantage. And if you follow the tests as kids go from kindergarten to 12th grade, you'll find that both groups learn a lot more. But you'll find that the curves move up in parallel. So in fact, the inequality that we see when kids finish high school and some go to college, it was there at kindergarten entry. And so that, to me, really changes how you look at the whole situation. You get very, very interested in what happens from birth to age 5 and what happens from kindergarten to, let's say, 4th grade. Because during that time period, the kid's foundation to do well in the later, more advanced material is laid. And as I had found out so many years ago about Dallas, if you start behind, you will very much get to 8th grade with an average reading ability at 5th grade level. And basically, there's no recovering from that. In the real world, with real people, while you might imagine that some intervention could do something, it's hard for 8th graders who are maybe 13 or 14 years old and have all kinds of pressures on them. It's hard for them to make that kind of a change after all those years of being behind in school. So for me, it said that if you really want to reduce inequality, you have to take it back to when school starts, and perhaps before.
George, thanks for that work you're doing out in Orange County. It's a huge help to the community, but also it's an example for all of us here at the school. And thanks for sharing that work and your background in research with us here today.
Thank you, Richard.